Hi everyone, I'm going to show you today a film of how I go about using palette knives to make acrylic paintings. Here you see my favourite type of palette knife. These are rectangular, square-ended, flat-ended. They're not the traditional type of palette knife, so I do find that most often palette knives which are sold in art shops are what I call pointy-ended or triangular-ended. And I just don't find that they work well for me. I love these square-ended ones, which you can also get in much larger size or much smaller size. But pretty much the only palette knife I use, and I use often, is this type. Why do I like them? Well, I like that you can paint with them, apply paint with them. You can mix paint with them, either on your palette or on your painting. Once you've got that paint applied thickly using a palette knife, it then brings you all sorts of options of drawing into the paint. And whatever colour is underneath your thick, wet acrylic paint will come through when you draw. Using any tool you want, really. You can use the wrong end of a paintbrush, you can use a pencil as I just did, or this plastic scraper tool. While this is still wet, I can think, oh no, that's not what I wanted, and I can go right back over it and obscure the whole thing. Can push the palette knife onto its side and scratch away, and look, here's an effect which I hadn't intended at all. The lines which I drew in have shown up when I scrape off the thick acrylic. So just experiment and experiment. Palette knives I also use for taking paint out of my paint pots. All the excess paint that I have on my palette knives and on my brushes, before I put brushes or palette knives into water, that's the sound of my water jar, I rub off all the paint that I can onto a cloth, an old t-shirt or old socks or paper napkins from cafes, anything like that. And the reason for doing that is to make sure that as little as possible acrylic paint is going down the sink when you empty out your paint water. So, lid off, and I use my palette knives to take the paint out of my paint pots and put it onto my palette. I didn't want to put this colour here, but there we go. This is yellow ochre, one of my favourite colours. You can use palette knives to create quite delicate little marks, quite big, thick, very big, thick, splodgy marks. With acrylic paint, I can leave the paint as thickly as this and it will eventually dry. You can scrape away into that. Just a really good tool to expand your painting if you're using acrylics. I shall show you some of the triangular ended ones as well. So just you get very different marks, and of course these can be useful. You should try them out if you like the look of palette knives. This is quite a long bladed one. If you push your palette knife down and then pull it back up like this, you get these interesting textures. I'm going to clean that knife again. And now I'm going to bring in a completely different colour and a lovely bold blue, cobalt blue. So now, if I just gently touch this on top, the wet blue will not mix much with the wet yellow ochre underneath. If I press this down, much more, you'll start to get more mixing going on. Now I'm going to try using my favourite shape to scrape away. That's interesting. Some of the yellow ochre shows up on the edges of my scraping. Or I can take it all away, or let's try putting it back. Oh, look how it's getting completely different. Sort of very mucky as the colours mix together. Now let's try drawing into it again. Or you could even write into it. Leo. This sort of thing could be good for adding texture into perhaps the grassy foreground of a painting. Or foliage onto trees. Or a rocky shore. Or just little highlights on the edge of a building. Perhaps moonlight catching on the gable of a house. So lots of those scribbles are still showing through underneath. Right, so get yourself a palette knife and just experiment with it and see what you think. You can get these quite cheap, very cheap sets where you get normally 5 different plastic palette knives. They're fine, but I personally much prefer the wooden handled, metal bladed ones. And I'm trying to remember always to wipe the paint off onto cloths rather than putting it into water and therefore into the water system. Alright, thank you for watching.